When talking about music, it's really important to make music. And so we're going to be using as a focus for our discussion of what makes music great, a particular piece of music which all of you in this room can play, and many of you can play it better than I can, but it's accessible to everyone. It's very well known. And we're going to find it's an extraordinarily wonderful piece of music. And this is the Prelude with which Bach begins the Well-Tempered Clavier from about 1722. And it doesn't do any good to be talking about music without listening to it. So I'm going to play it through one time. Many of you have scores, you can follow along. But you don't have a score, don't worry, you all know it. That's an extraordinary piece of music. But it's my job in the next few minutes or so to convince you just how extraordinary it is. So to do that, we're going to have to do some real musical discussions of it. And I put up on the screen a synopsis of its harmony. Now I'm going to be using technical theoretical jargon for this. If you don't understand it, it's completely foreign to you. Don't worry about it. I think you can follow along anyway. But what you have here are the chords for the prelude. Blocked along with each of the measure numbers. And here I have my fancy Home Depot pointer. The double bars represent important modulations. Now, if we move from there, let me get our next slide. If we move from there over to here, this is where you have the technical jargon. I've got to go through this a little bit because it's going to be important. Bach begins with that tonic chord, we call this a tonic chord, going to a supertonic 4-2 to a dominant. This is a dominant 6-5 back to a tonic. Now this all means that Bach here is starting in the key of C, and then he modulates to what we call the dominant over here to the key of G. And in measure 11, he's done that modulation to a new key. And the reason why composers modulate is because there are two rules, really only two rules when writing music. Number one, it must be beautiful, and number two, thou shalt not bore. And unless the music modulates, it tends to be boring. It doesn't always have to be. Satie got away with a whole different way of doing it, but generally you want to modulate so you don't bore. So Bach goes over here to the dominant, but we're going to find something very unusual here in this measure 8. We're going to be talking about that a fair bit. And in measure 7, Bach has this chord. And then in measure 8, this. With a very, very strong dissonance right here between a B and a C. That's called a minor second. It's very dissonant. And not only is that minor second dissonant, it's part of a chord, which if we spell it in root position, it's C, E, G, and a B natural. Now that is a major chord with what we call a major seventh. Now for us, in 2013, that's a perfect, lovely consonance. And if I were playing piano at the Rainbow Lounge, and there's a cup up here for the tips, I could end almost any of my cocktail music pieces with that lovely seventh. It's a complete consonance for us. But in 1722, it's not a consonance. It's a very, very strong dissonance, and it's a bizarre dissonance. I'm going to be coming back to that. So Bach modulates to the key of G, and then having modulated to the key of G, he comes back to the key of C, here in measure 19. And here in measure 16, we have a similar chord to that very strange chord I showed you before. It's this chord. That same chord we heard before that Bach used. It's a major chord with a major seventh, but this time on F. There's that seventh. And then Bach goes back to the key of C, measure 19, and then very briefly, has kind of a modulation to the key of F, and then continues back to the key of C. And with that modulation in the key of, very, very brief suggestion of the key of F, here we are in measure 19, measure 20, with the dominant of F, which we would expect Bach to do this. To the key of F. Nice, big, what we call a tonic chord in the key of F. But Bach doesn't give that one to us. He gives us this instead. It's another major seventh chord. Very, very strange for 1722. But then he continues back to the key of C. Now, there are a variety of versions of this prelude, at least 3, possibly 4. And if we had a whole lot of time to spend with this Prelude. We go over all of them. The one which I played for you is the one we recognize today as primarily the authoritative one. And these other ones are up here. They have a variety of different origins. I particularly love one by that was edited by Czerny. Czerny believed that Bach, the Czerny version, doesn't have 35 measures, it has 36, because Czerny kind of believed that Bach would never end a piece with as odd a number of measures as 35 instead of 36. So there is one in that version which is an extra measure. And here you have the various versions lined up on top of each other, and there are some differences between them. And we go to the end, and we can see that some are 27, 24, 35, and the one possibly 36. Now, the point with all of this is that this manuscript, or this piece of music, exists in several versions. Now, the one we're studying is the one that has become recognized as Bach's final decision and the authoritative version. But there are these other ones which do exist and are authentic. Now, one of the questions that we have is these other ones have different lengths. Now, I told you that this piece was a great piece, and it was by Bach. All right, now we sit down and we hear someone say, this is a piece by Bach, and it's great, and we just assume it's true. I want you for a moment to think, well, maybe it's not true. Maybe Bach wrote this, and it's a lousy piece. Right? It could be. It could be a lousy piece. And just because some professor in overalls in Tennessee tells you it's a great piece, he could be full of hot air, right? It's perfectly possible. So let's just pretend for a little bit that maybe this isn't such a great piece. And there are different versions of it, and the versions of it, most of them are shorter. Now, here is where I'd like to introduce to you a rule of great art, and we're going to be talking about rules a little bit later on. And there's a very, very important rule, and I call it the rule of just enough. Now, one way to think about the rule of just enough, and let me get the lights down because that is a really good slide. I want you to see it. See that bridge? Okay. Now, we take bridges for granted, but bridges are really, really important and really, really wonderful. They help you get across something which is dangerous. That's what the bridge does. So when you build a bridge, what do you want the bridge to do? You want it to go across the chasm, and you want the bridge to hold you up. And for that purpose, you want the bridge to be strong, because you don't want to fall down because you might die. So you want the bridge strong. But you've got a problem in building the bridge. You want it to be strong, but the bridge is too strong, it will collapse under its own weight. So you want the bridge just strong enough. Just strong enough to support itself and the weight that it is going to bear, but not so strong that it's going to have excessive material on it, which is going to force it to collapse. You also don't want to spend more on the bridge than you have to. It has to be economical. This is the law of just enough. It's a very important rule in engineering. It also is very important in giving a dinner party. Maybe you've given a dinner party and you've had your friends over and it's been a wonderful dinner party and it gets to be about 10:45 or 11. I mean, if you're in Spain, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. But here in Tennessee, about 10:30 or 11 or so. And it's time for everybody to go home. You've had the dessert, you've had after. But your guests just aren't picking up on the little clues that you're giving them. And they're staying longer and longer and longer, to the point where what was a lovely dinner party becomes a social disaster, in which case you can hardly wait to get them out of the house. What is the rule for a really good dinner party? Well, you want to stay just long enough. Dear Abby had a great letter in regards to this. Someone wrote in and said they were having problems with their neighbors because their neighbors would always come over about at dinner time, and they felt necessary to offer them dinner, and the neighbors stayed forever and forever and forever. And could Dear Abby help her with this? And Dear Abby said, well, I really can't, but maybe one of my readers will. And one of the readers sent in to Dear Abby said, Dear Abby, we had exactly the same problem. We had the neighbors who'd always show up just a little bit before dinner time. They'd hang around. We felt we had to offer them dinner. They would never leave. This is what we did. Finally, at the end of the dinner, we called in the family dog. And we picked up all the plates, and we laid them out on the floor, and the dog cleaned the plates. And then as we were talking, we picked them up, and we put them back into the cupboard. They never came over for dinner again. I mean, that's one way to deal with it. Now, the law of just enough. You don't want too much. Whether it's a dinner party, whether or not it's a bridge, one of the main characteristics of a great work of engineering, a great work of art, is the rule of just enough and no more. Now, this is interesting when we come to look at the Bach, because maybe the Bach piece is too long. Could it be improved by being shortened? Now, think about that piece. Remember, Bach began in the key of C, went to the key of G, and then he modulated back to the key of C. Well, couldn't he have ended the piece then? But then he modulated to the key of F, a little brief kind of tonicization, we might call it, and then back to the key of C. And then there's an extended kind of cadence over a pedal point. Could Bach have made the piece better by making it shorter? I mean, that is a legitimate question. When we look at the bass in that piece, this is what we see. Where's, oh, my pointer. This is his first note in the bass, the real first note. By the time he gets to measure 11, he's gone to the key of G, and that is his real first note in the key of G. Then back to the key of C, and that's his real note in the octave when he comes back to the key of C. Then to measure 21, that brief tonicization of F, and then finally measure 32 to that C in the bass. And that is maintained as what we call a pedal point. That means the pitch which is sustained in the bass over several measures to the end of the piece. Well, that's kind of an interesting pattern. If we look at those relationships, from C down to G is a perfect fourth, from G down to C is a perfect fifth, from G down to F is another perfect fifth, and from F down to C is another perfect fourth. And I used a very, very important word. And the word that I used was pattern. And this kind of pattern is called a chiastic pattern. It comes from what looks like an X, the Greek letter chi, and was an important device in rhetoric, going back from classical antiquity, then all the way through the Middle Ages, certainly into the Baroque. It's a symmetrical design. Now, you can see this kind of symmetrical design in this passage from Matthew 19, at least in the English translation. But many that are first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Do you see how this is kind of an arch shape? It is the same at the beginning, and then it's reflected at the end. That's a chiastic pattern in rhetoric. If we look at that bass line again, and let me pull up that slide. If we look at that bass line again, we can see that we have that chiastic pattern. And it also is interesting, at least this was true from the Middle Ages on, that the first letter of Christ's title begins with the letter, this letter X, or chi in Greek. Now, of course, the Greeks in classical antiquity didn't care about that, but that became an important aspect of Christian civilization from at least the late Middle Ages and certainly into the Baroque. And so we can see that, well, maybe one reason why Bach didn't want to end the piece right here or even here is that he was interested in creating a rhetorical pattern in his bass. Does that make sense to you? So there's more going on than just kind of filling in these arpeggiations. So we've answered kind of that question, why the piece doesn't end sooner, although we haven't really completely answered it. Let me pull up our lights just a little bit. Because I haven't answered that question completely, because, let me play this for you. In measure 28, Bach has this, which is a leading tone, what we technically, the jargon is the leading tone of the dominant over a tonic pedal, over a dominant pedal, going to the tonic 6/4, to a dominant 7th, with a 4/3 suspension, and what you expect to happen right here. End of the piece. But that's not what Bach does in measure 32. This is what he does. Instead of what we call a tonic chord, the C major chord, he gives the C major as dominant of F. Now my point is that we kind of have said why Bach couldn't end it any sooner, but we haven't answered the question is why doesn't he end it there? Now, by the rule of just enough, he should, because the rest of the piece is excessive. Ooh, you just said Bach made a mistake, right? Well, he did, because he should have ended the piece there. And the rest, it's just excessive, unless there's something else going on. Do you understand the question, though? He could have ended it here. Why didn't he? And Linton says he should have. All right. Now that should perhaps sound a little odd to you. We're going to come back to that. Now let's look at those chords that I talked about, which were so dissonant. Remember, a major triad with a major 7th. Those chords which sound great at a cocktail lounge, but in 1722 are really, really bizarre. Now, they appear, this one appears in measure 8. This one appears in measure 16. And this one appears in measure 21. This one is in what we call root position, and this is not quite the way they appear in the music itself, but this is in this what we call 4/2 inversion with that minor second right here next to these 2 pitches on the bass, the same way over here in measure 8. Okay, let's say that you are the curator of Mount Vernon. You've gone through the main part of the building. You've come over to this wing kind of on the south side. You're in George Washington's office. Nobody's been there for a long time. There is this desk, this kind of secretary. You pull up the drawer, and there's a cell phone. And on it, to George, for Martha, happy birthday. Now, that's what's called kind of out of place, right? You might think that, oh, this is a joke, or this is a mistake, or George Washington was really very, very advanced, okay? Now, this kind of chord is fine in 2013, but very, very odd in 1722. Might it be a mistake? It certainly could be. And we'd have to go back and look at the original manuscripts. And checking that, we see that, no, it's authentic. It's there. But it's still deeply odd. It's deeply odd. It is kind of like finding that cell phone at Mount Vernon. Is there some sort of reason for it? Well, there is. It's an incredibly fantastic reason. But we need to do a little bit of more work going up that mountain before we get there. And in order to do that, I have to introduce to you the business of the golden mean. And I've talked a little while, so we'll take a short break and be back in 5 minutes for the golden mean.